Toyota's chairman just went on record and said he feels completely alone. Not frustrated, not cautious, alone. This is the man who spent years telling the world EVs would never win. And now he's terrified because they did. To understand why this moment is so significant, you have to understand who Akio Toyoda actually is. This isn't just the CEO of one car company. For the better part of a decade, Akio Toyoda has functioned as the ideological leader of the entire global legacy auto establishment. He is the chairman of Toyota, the world's largest automaker by volume. He is also the former president of the Japan Automobile Manufacturers Association, meaning he literally spoke on behalf of an entire nation's industrial policy. When Akio Toyoda talked, governments listened. When he pushed back against electric vehicles, boardrooms across Detroit, Stuttgart, and Tokyo quietly exhaled with relief. He gave cover to every executive who didn't want to make the hard pivot. He was the man who made hesitation feel like strategy. And for years, he played that role with absolute confidence. In late 2023, he stood in front of international press and made a declaration that sounded less like a business forecast and more like a manifesto. He claimed that the global auto industry secretly agreed with his anti-EV position. He called them the silent majority, a coalition of combustion engine defenders who were simply too politically cautious to say out loud what they all believed in private. That electric vehicles were a passing trend, pushed by regulators and activists, but ultimately rejected by real consumers. He wasn't just skeptical of EVs, he was certain they would fail, and he believed history would vindicate him. That was less than 4 years ago. Let's be specific, because the details matter here. In early 2024, Toyota made one of the most bold and precise public predictions any auto executive has ever committed to on record. He stated, not as an opinion, but as a near mathematical certainty, that battery electric vehicles would never exceed 30% of the global car market. Not in 10 years, not in 50, not in 100. His argument was that the remaining 70% of the market would permanently belong to internal combustion engines, traditional hybrids, and hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. That 30% ceiling became the intellectual foundation of Toyota's entire strategic direction. It justified their slow EV rollout. It justified their massive continued investment in hybrid platforms. It justified their hydrogen bet, the whole multi-pathway strategy. The idea that Toyota was being smart and balanced while everyone else was being reckless rested on that number being correct. So what does the actual data say? In China, which is not a minor market, it is the single largest automotive market on the planet, representing roughly 30% of all global car sales. EV market share has already surpassed 63%. That number crossed the threshold just last month. It didn't approach 30%. It didn't stall at 30%. It blew straight through it and kept climbing. Globally, 1 in every 4 cars sold today is now electric. The sector is growing at approximately 20% year over year. There are now more than 10 countries where AV market share exceeds 60% of total vehicle sales. The 30% ceiling didn't just get broken, it was dismantled entirely by consumer behavior. Not by government mandates, not by subsidies alone, but by millions of ordinary buyers making a choice at the dealership level. The silent majority Toyota believed in turned out to be a story he was telling himself. Which brings us to the interview that triggered this conversation. A recent piece published by automotive outlet Drive caught up with Akio Toyoda and asked him directly about the state of the industry. What came back wasn't defensiveness. It wasn't careful corporate language. It was something much rawer than that, he said. And this is a direct quote. Everybody is shifting to EVs. This is the biggest fear for me. It seems to me that I'm the only one. I feel very alone. Read that again, slowly. The man who spent years telling the world that the EV transition was overblown, that legacy automakers would be proven right, is now describing his biggest fear as the exact transition he said would never fully happen. The man who claimed to speak for a silent majority is now admitting he feels like the only one left. The arrogance is gone. In its place is something that sounds genuinely close to panic. And here's why that shift is so significant. When an executive of this stature publicly admits fear, it's not just a personal confession. It's a signal about institutional reality inside Toyota itself. Because executives at this level do not make emotional admissions unless the internal data is forcing the conversation. You don't feel alone unless your competitors have genuinely moved on without you. And that's precisely what happened. While Toyota was crafting multi-pathway messaging and doubling down on hydrogen infrastructure, competitors were building gigafactories, locking in lithium supply chains, and training entire engineering workforces around EV architecture. BYD scaled from a regional player to the world's largest EV manufacturer in the span of a few years. Hyundai and Kia launched the eGMP platform and started winning quality awards in a segment Toyota barely participates in. Even Volkswagen, despite its own significant stumbles, has more EV product on the road today than Toyota by a considerable margin. Toyota's competitors didn't slow down waiting for the silent majority to speak up. They built. There's one more layer to this story that deserves attention. The way parts of the automotive media have tried to frame it. The same article that quoted Toyota's confession also inserted a line suggesting that automakers are pulling back on AVs due to cooling consumer demand. This framing appears regularly in automotive coverage, often in outlets that rely heavily on advertising relationships with legacy manufacturers. But pause for a moment and hold both ideas side by side. The claim, consumer demand for EVs is cooling. The quote from the same article, everybody is shifting to EVs. This is the biggest fear for me. These two statements cannot both be true. If demand were genuinely softening, Akio Toyoda would not be expressing fear. He would be expressing vindication. He would be hosting a press conference and saying, "I told you so." Instead, he's saying he feels alone and afraid. That's not the behavior of a man watching a trend reverse. That's the behavior of a man watching a trend accelerate past him. The real-world numbers support his fear, not the media's framing. In Australia specifically, a market that was historically slow to adopt EVs, electric vehicle sales just hit a record market share. The figure sits around 20%, which sounds modest until you realize it represents more than double the share from the previous year. The trajectory is steep and still climbing. During that same period, Toyota's total sales in Australia dropped by approximately 30%. That's not a coincidence. As more Australian buyers move toward electric options, they are not choosing Toyota AVs, because Toyota has almost none to offer them. The buyers are simply going elsewhere. The multi-pathway strategy didn't protect Toyota's market position. It left them without a product when the market finally moved. There's a version of this story where Akio Toyoda is simply a man who read the future incorrectly, and that happens. Industries are hard to predict. Technology transitions are messy and nonlinear. But this particular miscalculation carries a heavier cost than a wrong forecast in a spreadsheet. Because Toyota didn't just miss the EV transition privately, they actively argued against it, publicly and repeatedly, at the highest levels of global industry influence. They gave permission to other legacy players to slow down. They shaped policy conversations, they delayed, and now the chairman of the world's largest automaker is sitting across from a reporter and saying he feels alone. That word, alone, is the real headline. Not the fear, not the market data. The fact that a man who spent years trying to build a coalition of resistance is now looking around and finding no one standing beside him. The industry moved, the consumers moved, the data moved. Toyota is still catching up.